Are you willing to accept Christ's invitation to know him more intimately, love him more intensely, and follow him more closely, and then go out into the world and live his good news? If you say yes, then you could be the 13th apostle. Join Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey, the odd couple of Catholic radio, as they ride the radio waves 2 by 2 to share the goodness, beauty, and truth of Jesus Christ and his church. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the 13th apostle.
Christians are, in general, a ridiculous minority around the globe, and the real Christians have always been so in the midst of the club members. We who live today are, in turn, such a minority in the view of the countless generations that have passed away. We are the foliage of one summer on an ancient tree, and if, within all these concentric circles, we are still one of them, what does this mean? The Lord of the church still meets us in his church, still. So let us joyfully, gratefully accept as much as our eyes and hearts can take in and bear. One day he, the near and the far, the familiar and the incomprehensible, the unimaginable, will meet us behind the threshold as he really is. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the 13th Apostle, where we explore the good, beautiful, which you just heard, and true of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church. This is Tom Caffrey with my partner, Dan Duddy. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Tommy, how are you?
After reading that, and this is probably the third time I've read that, I am wonderful.
I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Why don't you start throwing those words around? That's really good. So that was a passage from the book Bread Grows in Winter by Ida Görres. That's Gorres. And it's published by Ignatius Press. And the translator for this book is our guest tonight, Jennifer Bryson. Jennifer, welcome to the 13th Apostle.
Delighted to join you.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. It's great to have you.
So we just talked very briefly before the mics went live, and I was telling you how much of an impact this book has made on me. And the shock of it's one of these gems that we have in our faith that most of us don't know about. Now, you confirmed that. As we were talking, you confirmed that. I guessed that. I remember when I finished my graduate work in theology, Dan had asked me, well, what was the main thing you learned in that? And I said, how little I know. And this testifies to that. My not knowing about Ida's work and her letters and whatnot is amazing. So we want to know why you were drawn to Ida, how you and Ida developed this intellectual and spiritual relationship, the perspective of a translator, and the content of the actual material. You just look at the words and you translate them. I know that's not true. One reference in here by you is getting this spirit of and you actually made a change in one of the words, one of the translations, and I thought that was really interesting. That spoke a lot. So let's hear about you and Ida Görres.
Sure. So I stumbled on her very indirectly in 2019, and what a blessing for me that God put her in my path. And as I started to learn about her amazing life and her work, as I started to read her, I said, this is a voice the church needs today. Her work is incredibly relevant. So that's why I wanted to make it available. She was born in 1901 and died in 1971. So her main period of work covers the early to mid 20th century. She used to be quite a famous Catholic author. And I know, for example, that when Joseph Ratzinger was in seminary in 1946, that all the seminarians were talking about Ida Görres. I found references to this. She was also quite well known in English. Already in the 1930s, her works were picked up by Sheed and Ward, translated into English, and published in both the UK and the US. I found references to her work by Dorothy Day and others. But once the 1960s hit, there was a change in worldview and spirit among those who were becoming influential that meant that the voice of Ida Görres, the way she approached faith and the church, was the kind of voice they didn't want to hear anymore. Because she is both a modern author in the modern era, and as you talked about, she talks about the current generation of Catholics being like the leaves on a tree for one summer. And she knows that tree's alive and another, summer of leaves is going to come. So she has a very keen sense of the church being alive. She isn't a reactionary saying we just have to go back to the past. But she was very learned in church history, though not an academic, and she loves and understands and cherishes the very deep traditions of the church. She holds these together. The living church, her task was to be a Catholic in the modern world, and being rooted and having solace in these deep traditions. And so at a time when the certain revolutionaries were coming to power, especially in Germany, in the church, they were like, oh, we don't do that old fuddy-duddy stuff anymore. And she got pushed aside. After her death in 1971, during her life, she and her husband had the profound sorrow of experiencing infertility. Her writings on this are very moving, and it was the greatest sorrow and pain she endured during her lifetime. And as a result, there weren't children of hers or of their marriage to carry on her legacy and be a voice for her. Her siblings had mostly become secular and fallen away from the church, and their children weren't interested in the church. So that combination of a change in the zeitgeist, as the Germans say, the spirit of the age, and the fact that there weren't children to be a voice for her, she was just forgotten. So from 1965 until my first translation of her work in 2020, there wasn't a single translation of her work from English to German. And that was after decades of multiple translations. And then also in Germany, almost all of her works, except for the German edition of Bread Grows in Winter and another book that I've translated called The Church in the Flesh, they all went out of print. But these two stayed in print from a very small publisher.
Oh my God. So you are her child.
I don't know about that, but she has been a gift to me because she has had such a helpful impact on my own spiritual life. And it's such a joy for me now to hear about the impact she's having when others are now getting to read her work, and now in English.
You're carrying on the legacy. And that's beautiful. It's beautiful. That's inspiring to think that who's going to hear our voice as we go on? Who's going to know what we did? For a lot of people, they won't. But you've done that. That's a beautiful testimony.
Well, and that's also a credit to Ida Görres. She left something behind that we need today.
You're kind of going right where I wanted to go, too, with this. I must say, Jennifer, you have a captivating personality. The Holy Spirit, shines from you. And I get the feeling that you're probably in your heart of heart, if you were both both feet were on the ground together right now with Ida, you would be best of friends, I think. You see a lot in her that you perhaps see in yourself. And I think there's a parallel there. I know you're both highly educated, and she has this great whimsical way of writing, and she's known for candor and humor. And I can see that in you. I saw you on a YouTube recently, and I could see your personality coming through. Is it true? Do you think you would have been best of friends if you had spent some time together? And why would that be?
Well, I would be privileged if I got to spend time with her. I dream of getting to have lunch or have tea with her someday. Things that I love in her work, for one thing, she loves the church. She isn't writing from a perspective of being angry or fighting, although she's a defender of the church. Mm-hmm. And she also has an intellect that's very broad. As I mentioned, she was very highly educated, but she was not an academic. So she wasn't in one of the silos of, doing academic theology or academic philosophy, academic history. We need those deep academic dives. But she's somebody who's drawing from literature and theology and philosophy and the lives of the saints. And I have a mind that's very excited and curious about God's creation. So it's exciting to read someone who writes so broadly. Also, something that I love about her is she cares so much about her readers. So her audience was always to write for the laity. Her heart's passion throughout her life after she had a spiritual awakening at age 14 was, how do we move the person in the pew, the man or the woman, from a Catholic as kind of a vague cultural identity, hopefully showing up to Mass a few times a year at least, maybe more often, to faith on fire, to knowing God, to knowing the church that Jesus Christ left behind. So with that, she writes for Catholics writ large, and thus also she's so relevant today, as I mentioned before. And I know I'm repeating that, but I've just been astonished reading her work. I keep thinking I'm anxious when a new translation is coming out because it takes a bit of time for the editing and finding the right publisher and doing it right. But I think we need this book right now.
Yeah.
Right now. So.
Mm-hmm. And she does write for the laity. I've read the book. I didn't read the whole book, to be quite honest with you, but I've read enough to pose some pretty interesting questions and inspire me to dig right back into the book. And my wife will love the book too, by the way. We have Ratzinger honoring her, and we have Pope who would become Pope John Paul II with honoring her. But yet she wrote the book for the laity. There's something very inclusive about the way she can do that. Amen. How she can touch the hearts of perhaps, the greatest of holy men, and then the boots on the ground laity at the same time, right? What a knack.
That is a great observation. And Dan, since you said you haven't finished the book yet, I want to mention that I think the crown jewel of Bread Grows in Winter might be, there's definitely a lot of contenders. All 6 chapters offer a lot, but I think chapter 6, the last chapter, called Trusting the Church, might be the crown jewel of the book. It's an amazing lecture that she gave to the laity. There's that laity focus again, in 1970. And it was an audience of very highly distressed Catholics who were even beginning to panic. And
Excellent.
so...
Thank you. Yep, I'll go right to it. Thank you, Jennifer. Will do.
With your last point about the panic, I read several references in your book about that, the letters that she would receive. And even in the introduction by the Bishop Varden.
Yes, he wrote a foreword to the book.
A foreword. And he makes a reference to, similar to the panic and that the deconstruction of the church, the faith of Jesus, and going through choppy waters, but that the faith is the faith, and the faith remains as it always has been, the truth of it. And I think that when I look at the writing, and I'm glad Dan brought up Joseph Ratzinger, because it was great to see that he had written when I first got the book and saw that he'd written the eulogy for her. In my view, they have similar writing styles. John Paul II is brilliant, but very complex.
He's a philosopher.
He's a philosopher, exactly. Ratzinger, a florid, a beautiful writing, could convey the deep truths, deep concepts in a way that one could grasp the essence of it. Actually, you see that with Ida, and a bit more color too. Stuff that she could say, not as a member of the clergy, and certainly not as a cardinal or the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, no less. I don't think she pulls punches.
So one thing that then Father Joseph Ratzinger in 1971 comments on about her in his eulogy is he speaks of her as being courageous. And chapter 2 of Bread Grows in Winter is titled Demolition Troops in the Church.
Yes.
That is not a title that a timid writer puts on an essay. And she published that one in 1969, the week before the Novus Ordo came out. So this book has essays and lectures from 1967 to 1970 at a time when there's tremendous destruction underway and experimentation without a direction or boundaries. And she's bearing witness to that, but constantly helping her readers. She always wants to help the readers return to solidity of faith. And, you mentioned her courage. One thing that for me gives her a lot of credibility is when she's addressing some of the most serious problems, she never says, "Don't worry, it's fine, no problem." She names the problems. Like in the beginning of Trusting the Church, she has a list of real things that are going on. She talks, for example, about somebody in the Netherlands, and this is 1970, conducting what they called a quote-unquote marriage ceremony between two men in a Catholic church. She talks about a school where the Catholic school children are told to bring their rosaries to church because they're going to have the children put them on a fire and burn them and melt them down, because we don't do that old-fashioned stuff anymore. We're going to be a new church. And so
Wow.
she's aware that people are watching this happen, a generation that grew up with tremendous stability in the church, and they're confused and they're frightened. And she has her finger on the pulse because she's receiving letters from the laity, because she's by this point a very famous writer, and people have been writing to her, and she's aware that they're afraid and confused. And so these essays and lectures address that. In addition to providing clarity, for example, chapter 5 called Remarks on Celibacy. An unexpected impact of this book is that a few different people who don't know each other have written to me and told me that they've been buying copies of Bread Grows in Winter for seminarians
Oh,
because they
beautiful.
found chapter 5 on remarks on celibacy so clarifying about the priesthood and celibacy.
There's something very validating about her writing in 1970 about, and so profoundly, vividly, without having been to the present, obviously, and attacking it so precisely with what we're facing here today. There's something very cool about that. And I think I heard you talk about, whether you're quoting Görres or not, about faith itself. The truth of Christ itself stands alone always. It's always in the present. And I thought that was beautiful. And of course, I'm paraphrasing you, but I wanted to just piggyback off what you just said. Looking back to her writings in the 70s, how do you see her message speaking to women in the church today?
She was very concerned already from the 1920s and 30s about the modern era trying to reconceptualize what a woman is in ways that are outside of God's order for creation. Keep in mind, she's very educated. Already in the 1920s, she was an editor of one of the journals in the Catholic Renewal, and she was well known for her writings back then. In the early 1930s, the Bishop of Meissen hired her for a leadership role leading apostolates for girls and women in the diocese. She isn't a timid, quiet wallflower, but she saw feminism, for example, as a deep threat. And during the 1930s and 40s under the Nazi era, actually one of her specialties was she published 3 volumes of essays and short stories. She used fiction in very wise ways for girls and young women because she was afraid that the new conceptualization of womanhood pushed by the Nazis was so dangerous. And she was so clever in using literature to convey healthy, wholesome role models. And her books on marriage, one in 1949, one in 1971, offer so much today to renew and rebalance man and woman in relationship to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Since you brought up marriage, no, I would say for sure, the most convicting part of this book so far, and I've read a few chapters, as on page 65. It's a letter for our image of Christ. And still others are not pious at all. But when it comes down to it, his commandments and prohibitions are the final guidelines of their decisions. They submit to the church just because they believe she represents his will. Thus, angrily and gnashing their teeth, they submit. Yet I think of the unhappy ones who do not divorce because of this, of the divorced who forego a second marriage to someone newly discovered. Staggering testimony is that he is Lord.
Yes.
And as some in
Ooh,
our
I
audience
get
know,
chills.
I got him after 20 years. My marriage blew up and it was pretty devastating. And that was 18, 19 years ago. And struggle for many reasons. But when I read this passage, it was overwhelming. It was like somebody was reaching down to me and rallying me, like holding the flag of faith, the flag of the church, the flag of Jesus Christ, and saying, those divorced who forego a second marriage to someone new, staggering testimonials that he is Lord. I'll never forget that.
Mm.
Yeah. I actually used that as one of the epigraphs in the book that just came out, What Binds Marriage Forever, that she wrote in 1971. And in What Binds Marriage Forever, she is taking head on the invasion of the sexual revolution by 1971, no longer being outside the walls of church, but there are Catholics trying to smuggle it inside. The book is about the effort to allow divorce and remarriage with full access to the sacraments and to change the meaning of what marriage is to simply an emotional relationship. And when the emotion's there, you got a marriage. When you don't, you don't. And in that book, she writes with tremendous sensitivity about those who are struggling in marriage and those whose marriages have collapsed. So she's never, Bishop Varden has a wonderful comment about what binds marriage forever, where he notes that Catholics often are so abstract that they lose touch with the messy reality of human life, or they're so deep in the messy reality that they lose contact with the metaphysical. And he calls out Ida Görres for navigating a balance that includes both. And this includes her sensitivity to the fact that while marriage is a profoundly beautiful institution, the human experience of it can be very tough.
Mm.
You know, and her most famous work is on hagiography and the saints. So I think this sensitivity she has to human suffering and the human experience is because she's such an amazing observer of human beings. With her focus on the lives of the saints as the main, core of her work.
And, when I hear human beings with the direction that the Holy Spirit is bringing me right now, H-U-M, human, and H-U-M, humor, she is known for some candor and humor, right?
Yes.
And can you give us an example, maybe from her essays, something that shows that?
Yes. So she is sometimes a bit sarcastic. When she's had enough, she doesn't pull punches. So one example that comes to my mind, there are examples in Bread Grows in Winter, but they're not coming to my mind at the moment. So I'm going to use one from What Binds Marriage Forever. She's talking about the new movement to try to understand what marriage is by studying other mammals.
That's funny already.
Yeah, there's one essay that's become very influential that's trying to redefine what marriage is for humans based on some research that was done about apes and their sexual lives. And so she finishes that and then she says, well, at least we finally have, a role model to look up to. She just sees the absurdity in some of this and drops these little liners. I think she suffered tremendous illness and physical difficulties in the 1950s and into the 60s. By the time she's writing and these essays and giving these lectures in Bread Grows in Winter from 67 to 70, she's partially bedridden. But because she has faith, she loves life and the Lord. And she had a beautiful relationship with her husband. And wonderful friendships. Humor is able to put its roots down in those.
Amen.
One of the things that caught me in the beginning was her description of a mountain. And I think of the college students I work with and have worked with, trying to have them understand that it's certainly if it's virtual, like what we're doing, the perspective on life and on a particular thing or a person. I think she spends at least 2 pages on what a mountain is as a template to go forward ultimately to who Christ is.
Sure. And it's great that you bring up college students because that chapter is a letter she is writing to what seems to be a young man who's a Catholic, who's become very upset. Keep in mind, I think that letter is from about 68 or 69, who's becoming worried about crazy things he's starting to hear academics say about Jesus. His faith is becoming unstable and he's stressed out about it. And so her big takeaway that she wants to tell him is they can say whatever they want, but who Jesus is doesn't change.
Exactly.
But she also points out to him with this mountain image that a mountain is real. And so what the mountain is what the mountain is. Somebody might say the mountain's pink. Well, they can say that, but it's not because we can go look at it. But also the geologists were to describe the mountain, the geologists would describe the rock layers underground. If somebody living on the west side of the mountain were to describe it, the view from their home, they'd be describing one side. A hiker might be describing what the, trails are like and what the vistas are like from certain paths. And all of those accounts are correct, but none of them tell you what the entire mountain is like. And she encourages this young man to draw closer to Jesus continually, because we keep on each of us as individuals in our spiritual lives knowing part of Jesus. So it's a great motivation, and it's a very beautiful image. And also her prose is very beautiful. She has a real sense for the literary and the poetic, and thus her description of the mountain, I can't do it justice trying to describe it. The reader's gotta read it yourself.
Reader, you gotta read that and stay focused on it. Spend some time on that.
Why the title, Bread Grows in Winter? Can you explain that?
So often when a book is translated, not often, but it can have an entirely different title in other languages is translated into, because of the audience and the need for the title to really make sense in the target language, so this case in English. And I was aware that Bread Grows in Winter could sound a little odd to the ear in English, but I had written to Ignatius Press and I said, given how important that title is to the book, I think it's really important, if you're willing, that we keep that title. So the title comes from chapter 6 of Bread Grows in Winter, which is that gem I talked about, the lecture Trusting the Church. And in a passage where she is talking about the suffering of priests, she watched priests have nervous breakdowns from 68 to 70 who were trying to defend Humanae Vitae against a public outcry in Germany, and academics who thought they were, the new cool voice, who railed against the church about Humanae Vitae. She also saw priests suffering in trying to just serve their flocks at a time when all of a sudden, after the Second Vatican Council, there was really an explosion and implosion at the same time, and they were suffering. And she contrasts the suffering priests with the priests who were always in the media talking about their new agendas, and how there were many priests that you didn't see every day in the media who were carrying out their priestly duties, were suffering under these conditions.
Absolutely.
So in that, she talks about the suffering of the priest as invisible martyr's blood, and how that blood can nourish the soil in the winter's night.
Oh.
And bread grows in winter is the image of how wheat needs to overwinter underground, winter a time when it's dreary and dark, looks like nothing's happening, even like nothing is growing or is going to grow. But the wheat is there during that time until its time comes to sprout in the spring, grow in the summer. And bread grows in winter is also a Eucharistic image.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Jennifer. Great answer.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Boy, how can you have such joy and sorrow? And the sorrow is only now that this conversation has to end, because it's been such a joy. Jennifer Bryson, thank you so much. You're the translator of Bread Grows in Winter, a book by Ida Görres.
Yeah.
Well, in English, though, we do all, call her Ida. Ida is the English pronunciation of that name, and I've got used to that. So,
Okay, wonderful.
That was wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Maybe we can have you back on again with more work. Stay tuned for the Angelus and Your Prayer Intentions with Peter and Jemmy.
Thanks to Brian O'Neill of Carmel Communications, who's helping to set this up. And thank you for Ignatius for the review copies. And of course, thank you, Jennifer. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much. You get these gems partly because of your support. So thank you for supporting WQPHradio.org. Marianne Jean James at the helm. Thank you. God bless you, Danny. God bless you, Jennifer.
God bless you, Tom. God bless you, Jennifer, and God bless you all.
Thank you for listening to The 13th Apostle with Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey. For more information on Dan, visit his website at www.danduddy.com or email dcduddy@gmail.com. Tom's website is faithpilgrims.com or email trcaffrey@faithpilgrims.com. How about you? Will you be the 13th Apostle?